The goal is to solve a quadratic equation by factoring. I know it's a quadratic equation because the largest exponent is 2, and we're going to follow these 3 steps for every problem. So the first thing I do when I look at this is I say, hey, that's quadratic, but it's not in standard form. Remember, standard form means all terms on one side in descending order of exponents. So I've got the pesky 27 that needs to come over there. Now I have standard form. The 27's over there. I have descending order. I'm in the form standard form equals 0. Next step, factor. Well, this is a trinomial with a leading coefficient of 1, so I get to ask myself what 2 numbers in the world multiply to negative 27 and add to 6. It turns out that those 2 numbers are positive 9 and negative 3. So I take those 2 numbers and I rewrite from standard form into factored form. Notice I copied down the equals 0. We've now completed step 2. We now go to step 3, which I say eyeball the answer. Well, what does that mean? You probably know what that means because we've probably done stuff like this already in class, but let's pretend you don't. What that means is look in each parentheses and ask yourself what x value would make that parentheses become a 0. Boom, that's one of your answers. What x value would make that parentheses become a 0? Boom, you have your answer. So now you know negative 9 and 3 are the 2 answers to this quadratic equation. By the way, if you're wondering why do x equals 9 and x equals 3 work in that equation, why are they answers? Here's how you can look at that. If I'm doubting negative 9 works, go ahead and plug it in to this factored form. And I would get from here a negative 9 in place of x, a negative 9 in place of x. And what I get is a 0 times a negative 12, which is 0, which means negative 9 made it true. That means negative 9 is an answer. The same thing with the 3. If I take my factored form and I plug in the 3 to see if it's true, I get 12 times 0, which is 0, which means 3 made that equation true. That last part might have been a little bit distracting. Just remember that you take your equation, put it in standard form, set equal to 0, you factor it, and you eyeball the answer. You just say, hey, what x makes each of those parentheses become a 0? In this next example, it's already set equal to 0. It's already in standard form. You just have to remember that this is difference of 2 squares factoring, and you would ask yourself, are there 2 terms? Yep. Are they subtracted? Yep. Can I square root both terms? Yep. This is the mental checklist you had for difference of 2 squares earlier. So if it meets yes for all 3 of these, you follow this pattern. And once you have factored form, you just say what x makes that parentheses become a 0? What x makes that parentheses become a 0? And you have your answers. By the way, the same problem could have been given to you in a lot more gross fashion. Look at that equation. Well, that's definitely not in standard form, but if I move the minus 3x over to the other side, now the 30 is the only thing left on the right. If I move the 30 to the other side, I now have x squared minus 25 equals 0. That's standard form. It's ready to factor. So this same problem could have looked like that, and it would have been your job to turn it into standard form. Once you have it in standard form, factor, set equal to 0, eyeball the 2 answers. Hey, don't forget about the greatest common factor. It's very easy to forget about the greatest common factor. If I look at this, I see that a 5 divides evenly into both of these, and there's an x variable in both terms. So now I choose the variable with the lowest exponent, which is 1, and I have a GCF of 5x to the first power. What remains inside the parentheses I have to make sure is correct by saying if I distributed the 5x back and the 5x to the 4, would I really return back to that? All right, so I had standard form, I factored, this time using a GCF, and now I'm going to eyeball the answer. That's step 3. In this case, a -4 is what makes that parentheses become a 0. And in this case, there's no parentheses, but you could think of it as a parentheses and just ask yourself the same question. What x value makes 5 times x turn into a 0? And that x value is 0 because 5 times 0 is 0. You're always going to use these 3 steps. Remember that factoring could use leading coefficient of 1, or difference of 2 squares, or GCF factoring, or even worse.